So this hand comes from the 1100 Venetian MSPT event that just took place, or is in the middle of taking place right now. It was on day 1B, and we're at the 1K, 2K level, and I have a pretty reasonable stack at this point. Reasonably good table, a few tough spots, but nobody that I'm particularly battling with to any significant extent, and I wouldn't say that any player at the table is giving me any significant trouble. I look down under the gun at pocket sevens, 7 of hearts, 7 of diamonds. I open to 4,500 at 1K, 2K, so 2.25 big blinds. Pretty small open, but that's going to be my standard in early position most of the time. I actually get 5 calls, so I get called by under the gun +2, the hijack, the button, the small blind, and the big blind. So the pot goes 6 ways to the flop. And to give a rundown on the players in the hand, under the gun +2 is a reg, who is the brother of a fairly well-known reg, I think. The hijack is also a reg. The button is a recreational player. The blinds are a reg and a younger woman who sounded like she had a Russian accent, who seemed like she kind of talked like a reg, but played a bit more like a recreational player. So I wasn't really sure. But in essence, there were no players in the hand that were particularly volatile in terms of I didn't know what to expect. So I had a reasonably good read on everybody. So we look down at 7 of hearts, 7 diamonds. Like I say, we open it up to 4,500. We get 5 calls. The flop comes out Jack of spades, 10 of diamonds, 7 of clubs. So we flop bottom set on Jack 10, 7. Obviously a very dynamic texture that interacts pretty significantly with almost everybody's range to some extent. People are going to very frequently put money in the pot with hands that interact with a board like this. 8-9 is definitely out there. Almost any player in the hand could have 8-9 suited. The big blind could certainly have 8-9 offsuit. Pocket jacks or pocket tens are unlikely to be in people's ranges, but they are plausible in the case of the under the gun +2 player. He may have flatted something in that region. It checks to me. The small blind and big blind both check, which I would expect them to do with 100% of their ranges in those spots. Now, this is a situation where under the gun, if I choose to lead out into this flop, into 5 other players, from under the gun, my range in that spot is going to look insanely strong. However, even if I did have one of the strong hands in my range, aces, kings, queens, a set, something like that, top pair, ace jack, something along those lines, the problem with leading out into 5 players on that type of texture is that if I bet and I get raised, which is obviously going to happen some frequency, it's a really tough spot for me because I don't really want to just be forced to bet fold a very strong hand, but I also don't really want to be in a position where I bet, call a raise, and still have to see a lot of potentially bad turns. For example, if I have pocket kings there and I bet and call a raise thinking my opponent might have some bluffs, then there's a 9, an 8 on the turn that can peel off, an ace, a queen that can complete a straight. It's all kinds of, there's all kinds of danger cards there for a lot of portions of my range. Plus, on top of that, there's very, very few hands in my under the gun opening range which have the capability to bluff into 5 players on a board like that. It's really just the king queens, maybe the ace kings and ace queens, but even that would be a little bit ambitious trying to bluff 5 players. So in this situation, even though a lot of people would be very tempted to bet with pretty much all their strong hands because they're not wanting to allow a bad card to come off on the turn, I decide to check with my set of 7s, planning to check raise. One of the reasons why I think 7s is a particularly good hand to check raise in this spot is because 7s unblocks all of my opponent's strongest hands and all of the hands that are going to bet the flop as a bluff and call a raise. So what that means is my opponents can still have Jack 10 for top 2 pair. My opponents can still have ace jack, king jack, queen jack. My opponents can still have all 16 combos of king queen in the deck, which means that there's a very high likelihood that if I check and one of them bets, which most of them, if they have a decent hand in that spot, will want to protect it to some degree, there's a very good chance that I could get called when I check raise and then have a chance to potentially get stacks in on a safe turn rather than being in a situation where I don't have the initiative, I bet and get raised, and people have a lot more opportunity to realize equity by checking behind the turn, something like that. So I'm going for the check raise here because I'm anticipating a decent betting frequency on the whole from the field of players that's left to act behind. Unfortunately, it does go checked around, so neither under the gun +2, the hijack, or the button decides to bet. So I lose my opportunity to check raise. But the hand is not over by any means. There are some bad turn cards here, but we're still in possession of a very strong hand. We're not planning to just fold. We have outs to a full house, even if somebody makes a straight of some kind. So we're in very good shape overall. The turn comes out the 6 of diamonds. So that does theoretically put a straight out there, but it's a straight that was already out there. So it's not actually a card that changes the board to any significant extent, except for making it slightly more dynamic in that it now puts a flush draw out there as well. So what happens here is small blind checks, big blind checks. I now recognize that I can't keep checking. I have to start betting at some point. I bet out 16.5K into a pot of, I believe, around 32K. So it was about half pot. The player to my left under the gun +2 tanks for a while and folds, and would later tell me that he folded a big hand. I'm not sure I believed him in this spot, but I guess I don't have too much cause to doubt. He told me that he folded pocket queens, I think it was. I'm not necessarily sure I believe that he would have just folded in that spot, but in any case, that's the information that he gave me at the end. I'm not sure what I make of it. The hijack calls and the button folds. So the hijack calls my 16.5K, and it then gets back around to the small blind. The small blind then reasonably quickly jams all in for 62,500, and the big blind folds. It gets back around to me. Now in this situation, it is a spot where it certainly crossed my mind that it's possible that this player has 8-9 in his range. It's not out of the question that the player might have felt like flatting 8-9 offsuit was reasonable pre-flop, given the kind of odds that they were getting, even though they were out of position. Although I thought that was less likely. 8-9 suited certainly in their range. However, I did feel like there was a very good chance that the player could have either potentially chosen to lead out with 8-9 on that flop 6 ways on the flop, or chosen to lead out on the turn with the intent of betting turn, getting called, and jamming river with the stack that they have. Because I think when the flop goes checked around, from the small blind's perspective, it's not likely to seem that likely that they're going to be able to bet, or sorry, they're going to be able to check jam a value hand, because nobody else in the hand is really perceived to have a high frequency of hands that can bet call against a jam. Nobody else in the hand is perceived to have a high frequency of strong top pairs in that spot, because all of the in-position players checked around on the flop. So if the small blind did have a value hand, I wouldn't necessarily expect them to play it in this way. So I have a very strong hand at this point. I'm not anticipating the small blind having too many strong hands. The hijack player who called, I'm anticipating in that spot they're most likely going to have a hand that either picked up a diamond draw, so maybe like an ace-5 of diamonds, something like that, or a hand that has a pair plus gut shot, like a 9-10, something along those lines. Obviously, the chances of that player having some hands that block the nuts make it even less likely that the small blind has the 8-9. And the odds I'm getting at this point are pretty good. I'm calling about another 46K to win what is a pretty big pot at this point. So I decide it's too good of a spot to fold. Checking the flop got me the result that I wanted. I got a safe turn card, and I was able to get somebody to put their stack in. So I'm not about to just go ahead and fold. I do reshove all in. The hijack folds reasonably quickly. The small blind tables 5-4 of diamonds for the open-ender and a flush draw, and we end up holding on a 9 of clubs river and winning a pretty substantial pot to bump us up to a stack of just over 200K. So that gave me 100 big blinds at that point in the tournament, gave me a really good chance to accumulate a bigger stack leading later on into day one. The evaluation I would have made of the small blind's play there is I'm not a massive fan of it, particularly because while the small blind wouldn't have necessarily anticipated the other players here to have too many bet calling hands in the sense of strength, the small blind has to recognize that I'm probably checking most of my overpairs in that spot as well. And therefore, in order for their bluff to be good in that spot, they have to be able to be reasonably confident that I'm capable of folding hands like aces, kings, and queens in that spot. And truthfully, at that point, I don't necessarily know if they rep enough strong hands that I would do that. The Second factor, I think, that makes me not love the small blinds check jam in this spot is the fact that 4-5 of diamonds, the hand that they had in that spot, it seems like a strong hand when they have an open-ender and a flush draw, but the reality is that their flush draw is a weak one, and their open-ender is the weak end of the open-ender. If they hit an 8 in that spot to make the, sorry, not an 8, yeah, an 8. If they hit an 8 in that spot to make the 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 straight, then anybody with a 9 is going to make a higher straight. So their one end of their straight is not particularly live, and if they hit a flush, it's definitely plausible that they could run into a hand like King Queen of diamonds, which could have checked the flop and then turned an open-end into straight and flush draw, which of course in that spot would probably not be able to fold and would be absolutely crushing the 4-5 of diamonds. So I think in that situation, the player would probably have been better served to just lead out in that spot rather than check jamming, because if they get raised, then folding out their equity is not that big of a concern because they don't actually have as much equity as it seems like they do. But at the same time, the check jam it's a large amount of risk for what seems like maybe a lesser amount of fold equity than they might have thought. So we do end up, like I say, getting it in. The hijack folds, we win a big pot. We accumulate up to 200K, and I ended up finishing day 1B with about 415K in chips, which was good for the third place stack on that day. And it's going to send me into day 2 tomorrow with one of probably the top 10 to 15 stacks going into about 500 to 600 players left in this huge tournament. So that was a pretty interesting hand, I thought. Worked out really well for me. And I suppose the main lesson there is that don't be afraid to check a strong hand on a wet flop like that, because in many cases, if the turn does come a good card, you can get stacks in the same way you could have done on the flop.